Hi there, this is reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and this is Chapter 29, Part 2 of 3. I have since read Aristotle again, looking for the massive evil that appears in the fragments from Phaedrus, but have not found it there. What I find in Aristotle is mainly a quite dull collection of generalizations, many of which seem impossible to justify in light of modern knowledge, whose organization appears extremely poor, and which seems primitive in the way old Greek pottery in the museum seems primitive. Now, if there was a paragraph to take down the giant of this university, and that Phaedrus has built him up to be, that sounds like it. Primitive like old pottery, that's funny. And it's interesting to read the summation of his work in terms of objectification, which is what we've been talking about. So what inspires such emotion in Phaedrus? Robert looks at with almost indifference. The works of Aristotle provoke extreme emotional reactions here. Extreme in regard in the case of the Great Books program, which the whole thing is based on, and extreme disdain in the case of Phaedrus. And when looked at objectively by Robert, indifference. So without value, let's say, without quality, Aristotle is flat. Think about the implications of that valueless objectivity that Robert has. Think about applying that in all many domains of life. In this section, there will be several examples of the dullness that is created by pulling out quality, by looking at things objectively. I certainly don't see Aristotle's works as a major source of either positive or negative values. Phaedrus comes across the exact section that sends him into the atmosphere. Rhetoric is an art, Aristotle began, because it can be reduced to a rational system of order. That just left Phaedrus aghast, stopped. He'd been prepared to decode messages of great subtlety, systems of great complexity, in order to understand the deeper inner meaning of Aristotle, claimed by many to be the greatest philosopher of all time. And then to get hit right off, straight in the face with an asshole statement like that, it really shook him. He read on. Rhetoric can be subdivided into particular proofs and topics on the one hand, and common proofs on the other. The particular proofs can be subdivided into methods of proof and kinds of proof. The methods of proofs are the artificial proofs and the inartificial proofs. And it goes on and on like this, whittling it down and down and down, just like that description, remember, of the motorcycle? And now we know that the one where he does the parts and functions. And we now know that that example has been given to us specifically to show us the method of traditional rationality, to show us the analytical knife. Remember the description of the motorcycle given way back in South Dakota, the one which carefully enumerated all the motorcycle parts and functions. Recognize the similarity? Here Phaedrus was convinced was the originator of that style of discourse. For page after page, Aristotle went on like this, like some third-rate technical instructor, naming everything, showing the relationships among the things named, then waiting for the bell so he can get on to repeat the lecture for the next class. And in this section, he sees the origin, Phaedrus sees the origin of the problem of teaching students to see things rationally, objectively, the rubric that he encountered when he went to teach rhetoric. And so it would make sense that he would want to go back to the origin of this problem. The reason why, if he were not more than 2,000 years dead, he would have gladly rubbed him out, is that he saw him as a prototype for the many millions of self-satisfied and truly ignorant teachers throughout history who have smugly and callously killed the creative spirit of their students with this dumb ritual of analysis, this blind, rote, eternal naming of things. Walk into any of 100,000 classrooms today and hear the teachers divide and subdivide and interrelate and establish principles and study methods. And what you will hear is the ghost of Aristotle speaking down through the centuries, the desiccating, lifeless voice of dualistic reason. So we could say that this is the origin of the analytic knife. And I guess you could say he's found the ghost of reason. But we'll see. It might be a little more complicated than that. So the description of the classroom that he is going to study, that he's going to take this first class in, mirrors that desiccating, lifeless voice. It has that same lifeless quality. The sessions on Aristotle were round an enormous wooden round table in a dreary room across the street from a hospital, where the late afternoon sun from over the hospital roof hardly penetrated the window dirt and polluted city air beyond, wan and pale and depressing. During the middle of the hour he noticed that this enormous table had a huge crack that ran across it near the middle. It looked as though it had been there for years, but that no one had thought to repair it. Do you remember the descriptions of the dystopian realities where all value, all quality is taken out and everything is wan and pale and depressing? And fixing a crack in the table doesn't have any utilitarian value, so why bother? Phaedrus asked the professor of philosophy if questions about Aristotle could be asked, and at the time, the only caveat that the professor gives is that you've got to read it and you've got to know it if you're going to be asking questions about it. Remember that Aristotle is the inspirational figurehead of the whole program. The next week, Phaedrus had read the material and was prepared to take apart the statement that rhetoric is an art because it can be reduced to a rational system of order. By this criterion, General Motors produced pure art, whereas Picasso did not. If there were deeper meanings to Aristotle than met the eye, this would be as good a place as any to make them visible. But as it turns out, he never gets a chance to bring it up, because when he raises his hand, this other student speaks out of turn, and he's disparaging about Aristotle. The professor of philosophy totally flattens him, viciously. And the viciousness of this attack against the student who just wanted to start a discussion, who wanted some dynamism in the classroom, let's just say, normal thing, but is pushed back into that, that Aristotelian framework, which he can't step out of, unless he really knows the material, which it turns out he doesn't. That causes Phaedrus to realize that that attack was really meant for him, for Phaedrus. The professor was primed for the attack and probably didn't expect this usurper. So didn't expect this kid to pipe up. So the kid kind of gets it, probably due to a reactive response by the professor, but the professor's not done yet. And now, with a gleam that indicates he's intended this all along, the professor of philosophy swings around his finger around and points at Phaedrus. You, sir, what are the three kinds of particular rhetoric according to the subject matter discussed? But Phaedrus is prepared. Forensic, deliberative, and epideictic, he answers calmly. And what are the epideictic techniques? Epideictic. The technique of identifying likenesses, the technique of praise, and that of encomium, and that of amplification. Yeah, says the professor of philosophy slowly. Then all is silent. So why is this professor of philosophy so dead set on attacking Phaedrus? Remember the letter? It's time Aristotle got his. So Phaedrus is already considered quite the enemy of the program due to this. He's declared that he's going to attack Aristotle. And in this particular program, of course, the Aristotelian framework is a really big deal. Remember, it's the crowning glory of the chairman's career, and it's the last great effort to change the direction of college curriculum. So this is considered a paradigm shift, and the school guards that victory very jealously. Also, the professor of philosophy knows how smart Phaedrus is, and Phaedrus, just by virtue of his intellect, is a threat to anyone who's teaching him, because chances are he's smarter than they are. Not only is he smarter than they are, but he has declared war on Aristotle in this letter. The professor of philosophy has made a mistake. He's wasted his disciplinary authority on an innocent student, while Phaedrus, the guilty one, the hostile one, is still at large and getting larger and larger. So it's a clever use of larger and larger there, and very true. later, okay, so we go back to the journey, and that journey mirrors the lifelessness of the classroom described, and the lifelessness, again, that objectification parts, where the value is stripped out of the situation, when the great goal is separated from the quality, and it no longer has that salience. And things are seen as strictly material, strictly substance, let's say. The gray, rainy skies and sign-strewn road descend to Crescent City, California, gray and cold and wet, and Chris and I look and see the water, the ocean, in the distance beyond piers and gray buildings. I remember this was our great goal all these days. So when you're just looking at it objectively, the goal means nothing. You're just there. There's the sea, and it's rainy, and it's cold and gray. So you see what he's doing? So we go back to the university again, and Phaedrus realizes that he's really got to know this material really well. Phaedrus studied hard during this period and learned extremely fast and kept his mouth shut, but it would be wrong to give the least impression that he was any sort of good student. A good student seeks knowledge fairly and impartially. Phaedrus did not. He had an axe to grind, and all he sought were those things that help him grind it, and the means of knocking down anything which prevented him from grinding it. He had no time for or interest in other people's great books. His attitude towards Aristotle was grossly unfair. For the same reason, Aristotle was unfair to his predecessors. They fouled up what he wanted to say. And that's an interesting observation, because you're going to see this run through, this diminution. So let's go through the lineage. And they're all doing the same thing to promote their agenda, and that's actually a pretty big deal. It's a very big deal. So we're going to be reading a dialogue, the Gorgias, or Gorgias. I'm going to call it Gorgias because I don't know how to pronounce it. Dialogue, Socrates and Gorgias, where he. So Plato is going to do it to the sophists in this dialogue. It's going to diminish their art. Aristotle's going to do it to Plato, and Phaedrus is going to do it to Aristotle. Aristotle fouled up what Phaedrus wanted to say by placing rhetoric in an outrageously minor category in his hierarchic order of things. It was a branch of practical science, a kind of shirt-tail relation to the other category, theoretical science, which Aristotle was mainly involved in. As a branch of practical science, it was isolated from any concern with truth or good or beauty except as devices to throw in an argument. Thus quality, in Aristotle's system, is totally divorced from rhetoric. This contempt for rhetoric, combined with Aristotle's own atrocious quality of rhetoric, so completely alienated Phaedrus. He couldn't read anything Aristotle said without seeking ways to despise and attack it. Now, the first thing I want to point out is it's kind of interesting how he's whittling rhetoric down to be a tool within reason. Remember, the opposite happened with Phaedrus's new rationality. Rationality was whittled down, reason was whittled down to a tool to be used within the broader reality of quality. So that's one thing. But so to put rhetoric down so low in the hierarchy to the point that it's just a practical science makes it objective, makes it a tool. It doesn't care, that particular tool, that practical science, doesn't care about value as science doesn't, in theory. So that it becomes this practical means of communication, rhetoric does, to be inserted where appropriate, and otherwise not any more useful than that. And here Robert points out that because Phaedrus was so partial, he also misses some ways that Aristotle might have been useful to him. For one, using Aristotle, I don't know how, but he implies this. He said that Robert could use Aristotle's method of bootstrapping different forms of knowledge. Meaning, I think something like an algorithm or heuristic for learning, so that he could learn, more efficiently, learn new and more material. And we already know one of Phaedrus's problems is his tendency to reinvent the wheel and just go in his own direction and not use the knowledge of other people to help him. The professor of philosophy lectured, and Phaedrus listened to both the classic form and romantic surface of what was said. The professor of philosophy seemed most ill at ease on the subject of dialectic. Although Phaedrus couldn't figure out why in terms of classic form, his growing romantic sensitivity told him he was on the scent of something, a quarry. Dialectic, huh? The only thing that was clear was that Aristotle was very much concerned about the relation of rhetoric to dialectic. To Phaedrus's ear, the same ill ease he had observed in the professor of philosophy appeared here. The professor of philosophy had defined dialectic, and Phaedrus had listened carefully, but it was in one ear and out the other, a characteristic that philosophic statements often have when something is left out. When you don't have the totality of something, it's hard to synthesize it. So if you have something that just isn't complete, it's hard to find a place for it, of the gestalt in your gestalt-seeking brain. And the implication also is that Aristotle knew he was leaving something out all along. And what he's leaving out is something like the acknowledgement of the soul of rhetoric, so that he can win his assertion that dialectic is superior to rhetoric. And 2,500 years later, this dis-ease permeates, this incompleteness. Unconsciously, the professor knows it. So the ghost of Aristotle conveys this because Aristotle himself formulated this with this, let's just say, conscious flaw. And that has gone throughout the years, up to the professor of philosophy and anyone using traditional reason. So something has been suppressed. What is it? In a later class, another student who seemed to be having the same trouble asked the professor of philosophy to redefine dialectic, and this time the professor had glanced at Phaedrus with another quick flicker of fear and became very edgy. Phaedrus began to wonder if dialectic had some special meaning that made it a fulcrum word, one that can shift the balance of an argument depending on how it's placed. It was. Now, I'm not 100% I'm going to get this right, what he means by fulcrum word. I think I could potentially be getting it wrong because I don't know Aristotle very well. But my understanding of this term, the fulcrum word, kind of reminds me of pragmatism. It depends on what you mean by the word dialectic. Do you mean it from a Platonist, or, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, a Platonist or an Aristotelian perspective? What you mean exactly by that word determines the whole foundation of your argument. So in pragmatism, William James starts the series of lectures with a story about what exactly do you mean by this word? And the word is going, and the phrase is going around. And so the argument, there's an argument that some of his colleagues are having, and he's asked to solve it. And the hypothetical situation is there's a squirrel on one side of the tree and a man on the other, and they keep going around each other, and the man never actually sees the squirrel, but they keep going around the tree. So the question is, does the man go around the squirrel? And it depends on what you mean by going around. So if it means going in the same, circumambulating in the same, the tree in the same way, north, south, east, west, then the answer is yes. But if it means going around the actual squirrel, seeing the squirrel and coming back at some point, then the answer is no. So going around can shift the argument depending on what it means. And I think this is what a fulcrum word means, but I'm not 100% certain. Dialectic generally means of the nature of the dialogue, which is a conversation between two persons. Nowadays, it means logical argumentation. It involves a technique of cross-examination by which the truth is arrived at. It's the mode of discourse of Socrates and the dialogues of Plato. Plato believed the dialectic was the sole method by which truth was arrived at, the only one. That's why it's a fulcrum word. Aristotle attacked this belief, saying that the dialectic was only suitable for some purposes, to inquire into men's beliefs, to arrive at truths about eternal forms of things, known as ideas, which were fixed and unchanging and constituted reality for Plato. Aristotle said there is also the method of science, or physical method, which observes physical facts and arrives at truth about substances which undergo change. All right, so this last part of the statement seems very important to our understanding of our present understanding of truth, which is material reality. It has to be evidence-based. This is still where in general, as a culture, we are in terms of understanding truth. It has to be there has to be evidence for it. It has to be proven. It has to be able, the scientific method. And so this strongly relates to the problem we talk about in this corner, or whether truth is in fact dependent on material proofs, or whether it is dependent on what is the best thing for the problem at the moment, which is pragmatism. Whether science is nested in religion, for example, or vice versa. And so do all these considerations, that we're talking about in this corner of the internet, do they have their origin right here in the establishment of the physical method? So in a way, we too are trying to transform present understanding of what has been created by this ghost of the physical method, or this ghost of reason, to something else that's informed by value, by what is good. So there is, there is with both Phaedrus and now us much later, trying to pull ourselves out of objectivity and into a reality that requires value, let's say. The duality of form and substance and the scientific method of arriving at facts about substances were central to Aristotle's philosophy. Thus, the dethronement of dialectic from what Socrates and Plato held it to be was absolutely essential for Aristotle, and dialectic was and still is a fulcrum word. Phaedrus wasn't insulted that dialectic had been brought down to the level of rhetoric. He was outraged that rhetoric had been brought down to the level of dialectic. Such was the confusion at the time. So why is Phaedrus such a fan of rhetoric over dialectic? Because teaching rhetoric is his vocation, and therefore he's biased. Probably to some extent, but really because rhetoric has a quality in the trait sense that there's a spontaneity to it. In the form that Phaedrus was teaching, there's a spontaneity to it. So that provides easy access to the expression of that pre-intellectual quality. Remember how bitterly Phaedrus objected to Aristotle's paradigm of how rhetoric should be constructed. And here's the structure. Make your essay fit into this Aristotelian structure. So to that he responded, and that's sort of imitation. You imitate this structure of the essay. And to that he responded that imitation is evil, and that that tendency towards imitation that students have learned has to be dispelled. And the way he dispelled it is like getting them to write about one side of the coin or the first brick in the Opera House in downtown Bozeman. So we'll go further into the explanation of what rhetoric really is and what's being left out in the last part of the chapter next week. For now, let's just say that Aristotle is not being forthcoming about what rhetoric really is. And that is one of the things that's making Phaedrus very angry. We follow the coast now, cold, wet, and depressed. The rain has let up temporarily, but the sky shows no hope. At one point, I see a beach and some people walking on it in the wet sand. I'm tired, and so I stop. As he goes off, Chris says, "What are we stopping for?" "I'm tired," I say. So he's tired. What is he tired of? Well, he's tired of fighting off Phaedrus. He doesn't think he can do it. And he's beset by this depressing hopelessness. This is more, I think, a description of what it feels like to have that specter of the next move, and that next move could be something pretty drastic and awful, that one where he thinks because he's now Phaedrus and Phaedrus is insane, he's going to have to separate from his son and potentially never see him again. We still are kind of perplexed by this. I think it was Coleridge who said everyone is either a Platonist or an Aristotelian. People who can't stand Aristotle's endless specificity of detail are natural lovers of Plato's soaring generalities. People who can't stand the eternal, lofty idealism of Plato welcome the down-to-earth facts of Aristotle. Plato is the essential Buddha seeker who appears again and again in each generation, moving onward and upward towards the one. Aristotle is the eternal motorcycle mechanic who prefers the many. So the contrast is obvious. Plato's the romantic, Aristotle the classic. And the interesting point here is that is very much how romantics are. They do see, the surface, the totality, the gestalt, the big picture, but they often miss specifics. They often don't have an eye for detail. And the classics can tell you about all the parts and how they work, and they tend to be orderly. Think of the big five, high openness is Plato, romantic. High conscientiousness is Aristotle, classic, in some way. So the motorcycle mechanic, the classical motorcycle mechanic, and the machine is running great, but it's dirty and it's not that stylish. And for the romantic John, the motorcycle looks great on the outside but keeps breaking down. And there's other contrasts: mystics versus rationalists or materialists. Mystics experience the whole, rationalists experience the material, the parts. I am myself pretty much Aristotelian in this sense, preferring to find the Buddha in the quality of the facts around me, but Phaedrus was clearly a Platonist by temperament. And when the classes shifted to Plato, he was greatly relieved. His quality and Plato's good were so similar that if it hadn't been for some notes Phaedrus left, I might have thought they were identical, but he denied it, and in time I came to see how important this denial was. So another interesting contrast between Robert and Phaedrus. You knew that this one was probably going to come. What I like about this, though, is an emphasis on the fact that you don't need to be a mystic to find the Buddha. This is the difference. This is what we're looking at in terms of technology going forward. We want to be able to find Buddha in the gears of a motorcycle. This is the difference between technology approached and made with traditional reason and objectivity, and technology approached and created with quality. The course in the analysis of ideas and study of methods was not concerned with Plato's notion of the good. However, it was concerned with Plato's notion of rhetoric. Rhetoric, Plato spells out very clearly, is in no way connected with the good. Rhetoric is the bad. The people Plato hates most, next to tyrants, are rhetoricians. The first of the Platonic dialogues assigned is the Gorgias, and Phaedrus has a sense of having arrived. This is at last where he wants to be. And where he wants to be is finding the origin of the problem. And Plato's assessment of rhetoric leaves out the other aspect of it, the high quality, the generative nature of rhetoric. And that's a big problem. And this is, this detective work is really getting to the heart of the matter. In Aristotle's philosophy, something has been actively suppressed, and you see that suppression here in the Gorgias dialogue as well. And that suppression manifests later in the professor's dis-ease. All during this time, Phaedrus has this sense that something huge is guiding him, but he doesn't know what it is. So time has no meaning. The only thing that has meaning is quality. And I guess that's what a truly inspired pursuit feels like. So Phaedrus right now is constantly in the flow state. That certainly is a description of the flow state. He has plenty of gumption. Days have become phantasmal and incoherent except in terms of quality. Nothing matters except that he has a new and shattering and world-shaking truth about to be born, and like it or not, the world is morally obligated to accept it. That's an interesting statement. The Gorgias dialogue is where Socrates beats down a sophist, a rhetorician, with dialect. In other words, he takes Gorgias's craft and frames it in a way to make it appear suspect. He objectifies it in the sense that he cunningly neglects the totality, the value, the soul, the whole art of rhetoric, and whittles it down to what you can see objectively. So he turns a flying machine into parts and functions. And then you take those parts and functions and focus them on achieving a particular preconceived notion, and you create that manipulative propagandistic rhetoric. Rhetoric has become an object, and as an object has parts, and the parts have relationships to one another, and these relations are immutable. One sees quite clearly in this dialogue how the analytical knife of Socrates hacks Gorgias's art into pieces. What is even more important, one sees that the pieces are the basis of Aristotle's art of rhetoric. And this really upsets Phaedrus, because up till now he's held Socrates in high esteem, and now Now Socrates just seems cunning and manipulative. He wishes he had been there to answer some of those questions himself. So you can see what's happening. Socrates knows full well what the art of rhetoric is, but he goes for the jugular and he disingenuously destroys any perceived value in rhetoric and just whittles it down to this objective, kind of flat, somewhat sinister, problematic approach that the sophists have, and that it is, it's not good. It's, as Plato said, rhetoric is not good, it's bad. So you see in Socrates the same suppression to make a point, to the same objectification of something that is a shadow of itself when you take the value out. At one place, Socrates asks, to what class of things do the words to which rhetoric uses relate? Gorgias answers, the greatest and the best. Phaedrus, no doubt recognizing quality in his answer, has written, true, in the margin, but Socrates responds that this answer is ambiguous. He is still in the dark. Liar, writes Phaedrus in the margin. Yeah. Socrates is not using dialectic to understand rhetoric. He is using it to destroy it, or at least to bring it into disrepute, and so his questions are not real questions at all. They are just word traps, which Gorgias and his fellow rhetorician fall into. Phaedrus is quite incensed by all this and wishes he was there. And why wouldn't Gorgias fall into a word? I mean, why would he be prepared for word traps? He's not expecting them. He's not expecting his craft, which he assumes they both understand in the same way. This is a gentleman's debate, he thinks. He doesn't expect this to happen, that his art is going to be decimated like that. And this really pisses Phaedrus off to the point that he wishes he was there, which I just love. I wish he was there too. I'm sure he wanted to stop this mess, which has caused so many problems thousands of years down the line. But at that moment, I think he just wants to be there to stick it to Socrates, to point out his deception. By the way, in Gorgias, you're going to find, again, some things that sort of mirror pragmatism. And we know this was, of course, a big influence on Phaedrus. Pragmatism is very flexible. It's very dynamic. And when you read about it, you'll see how much James' approach had in common with Phaedrus. Actually, I've been reading it. There's a really great paper written by David Buchanan, who was a student who majored in philosophy and wrote his dissertation comparing James' radical empiricism with the process of quality, the pre-intellectual awareness of quality. I certainly will do a video about that in the future. It's really a good read. So in this dialogue, Socrates proposes that there is belief and then there's knowledge. And Gorgias says, well, actually, all knowledge is belief in some form or another, and that very much reflects pragmatism. So the professor, knowing that Phaedrus' specialty is rhetoric, now, and also because Phaedrus hasn't spoken up, he's known better than to say anything. So the professor starts starts being fooled into believing that Phaedrus is a good student. And so he thinks it might be fun and a good idea to engage him in something like the dialogue that's taking place. So the professor is obviously going to put himself in the role of Socrates, and he asks Phaedrus a question that's very similar to one of the questions posed by Socrates to Gorgias. And the professor obviously wants to prove how dialectic will win over rhetoric, and do kind of this fun thing in the class with this guy he knows is very smart, he's starting to think isn't that bad. Poor thing. So he asks him the question, is it your opinion, this, that, and the other? And Phaedrus asks, you mean my personal opinion? For months now, since the innocent student disappeared, there have been no personal opinions ventured in this class. Yes, the professor said. So the student tried to give his opinion, and that's why he was annihilated. And then the next time he was gone, and he hasn't been back, by the way. Phaedrus is silent and tries to work out an answer. Everyone is waiting. His thoughts move up to lightning speed, winnowing through dialectic, playing one argumentative chess opening after another, seeing that each one loses and moving to the next one, faster and faster, but all the class witnesses is silence. Finally, in embarrassment, the professor drops the question and begins the lecture. So you already know how Phaedrus is when he discovers a nagging problem. It totally takes him over, obsessively. So to the professor in the class, that's just this guy who's dead silent, and it's really uncomfortable. And so the professor just drops it and moves on with the lecture. But in his mind, Phaedrus is racing through all the possible dialectic questions in this scenario and all the traps in his mind, so he gets madder and madder at each new discovery of the viciousness and meanness and lowness of this art called dialectic. Phaedrus's mind races on and on further, seeing now at last a kind of evil thing, an evil deeply entrenched in himself, which pretends to try to understand love and beauty and truth and wisdom, but whose real purpose is never to understand them, whose real purpose is always to usurp and enthrone itself. Okay, so he says deeply entrenched in itself. Remember that we all suffer from the ghost of reason, and then he's recognizing it. This is kind of, Phaedrus seeing some shadow, let's say. Dialectic, the usurper, that's what he sees. The parvenu, muscling in on all that is good and seeking to contain it and control it. Evil. The professor calls the lecture to an early end and leaves the room hurriedly. After the students had filed out silently, Phaedrus sits alone at the huge round table until the sun through the sooty air beyond the window disappears and the room becomes gray and dark. So, we're going to get to the conclusion of this detective story in chapter 29, part 3. So I hope that made sense, and I will see you next Sunday for chapter 29, part 3.